transition in. For those of you who don't know Dr. John Hellerstedt, you're probably in the wrong room. This is one of those nice kind of cadence pieces. Just late last year, Dr. Hellerstedt ended his term as Commissioner of the State Department of Public Health, and I think that the perspectives that he's going to be able to offer us today, and also looking forward, what are the things that we should hear from, are just going to be really invaluable. We're going to have just a quick kind of discussion up here, and then we will open it up for Q&A. So crank up the old thinking box here, get a little coffee to make that a little bit easier here in the morning. But with that, I'd ask you to help me welcome Dr. John Hellerstedt.
Thank you, Carter, and thank you to State of Reform for inviting me to be here. It's a great honor to be able to address you all today. I'm going to talk about the pandemic, and I want to try and give my perspective, and I hope infect you with my perspective as well, on what kind of went right, what went wrong, and why. So first of all, we need to really step back and look at it. And we all remember the pandemic. Moreover, we all remember it from different perspectives. But here's a trigger alert. Not all perspectives are objectively valid. My remarks will examine our preparation for and response to the pandemic, but more especially will address the folly and wisdom we are taking away from that ordeal. Don't think about the 50,000-foot view. Think of the view from Mars, from way, way outside the box. And think about more than just a public health crisis. Think about any kind of really serious crisis that society would face. The pandemic was a war, and I say that in all respect. I'm not a veteran. I've not been in combat. But I think by any definition, the pandemic was a war. It was a matter of existential importance, matter of life and death, great cost, personal and societal resolve, sacrifice, resilience, recovery, and learning. I believe there is a tacit consensus that we won this war, but there seems to be nothing but discord when it comes to our understanding and endorsement of the conduct of that war. Here I will betray my most fundamental conclusion. If you count the current status of the pandemic as a victory, then rejoice. Learn from what went right and what went wrong and why. Do not look back with myopic hindsight, that is to say with blindsight, and Monday morning quarterback the strategy and tactics that led to victory. War is chaos, and victory in the face of chaos must be counted a victory. Fundamental to a proper perspective of the struggle is that the enemy was and remains a novel respiratory virus. We must grasp that fact, the fact that that implacable foe is solely responsible for all the illness, death, suffering, cost, and disruption we endured. Was there collateral damage? Was the response imperfectly human? Absolutely yes. But such imperfection is inevitable when human societies find themselves in an existential struggle where rapid mobilization in the face of the unknown and the unknowable is essential, because every delay entails death and risks defeat. We should be grateful that despite all of the noise and confusion, enough people did enough of the right things, enough of the time, that it worked. In contrast, to assert that none of the unwelcome measures we endured were necessary or effective is the very quintessence of blindsight. Those who do not study history are doomed to repeat it. It is essential for American society to come to consensus about a response to the pandemic, because the lack of common vision and resolve that currently prevails risks the next disaster, whatever form it takes, will devolve from catastrophe into catastrophe, because no one trusts the only institutions capable of optimizing our ability to prepare, resist, and recover. Those inclined to blindsight often point to the Great Barrington Declaration. Anybody here? No hands, but anyhow, that's okay. It was greatly declared in October of 2020. It was signed by lots of people, scientists, epidemiologists, and that sort of thing. And it was done in October of 2020, mere months into the pandemic. It expresses some very laudable goals and some sound basic science and theoretical constructs. In that sense, written when it was, it seems prescient. And that Great Barrington Declaration is often held up as proof positive that there were people out there that were smarter than everybody else, and that if we had only listened to them, we would have enjoyed both unbridled liberty and a resounding victory at a fraction of the cost. Alas, the distinguished authors and signatories, mostly lauded academics, are no doubt proud of their work, but they dealt only with theory and not praxis. Praxis is how you get things done to accomplish your goals. To my reading, as someone tasked with advising public health policy at the state level, the not-so-great Barrington Declaration is painfully short on details. To quote Hamlet, there's the rub. It's not about science, it's about society, and I want to talk about science kind of in two senses. One, by science to me, I mean the content of scientific knowledge, the data, the theories that go into it, the laws of nature, our understanding of the pathophysiology and physiology behind health and disease. In another sense, though, when people talk about science, they talk about the powerful social institutions in which most advanced scientific research and development takes place in the modern world. The content of science is objective and verifiable, while scientific institutions are social institutions. Those institutions can fall prey to the same vicissitudes that affect the larger society. Science, and by that I mean both meanings, science can advise, but science cannot and should not dictate public policy. I sincerely hope you retain this insight. Science and scientific institutions can advise, but science cannot dictate policy because science is unable and not authorized to strike a balance amongst the myriad opposing needs and interests that have defined every human society from the beginning of time. It's politics. Politics is not a four-letter word. In fact, it's the way we deal with competing goods in the society, competing good interests. In a just representative democracy, political discourse and law making are a sacred trust, and it comes from the people and is for the people. I want to talk about my idea for the future, if you will, and that is what I'm calling a pandemic war college. To cure the blind sight, I want to create this war college, if you will. I think it's a catchy name. I know it can't really be the name of what they do with it, but it would be an ongoing, robust, and unassailably fact-based, nonpartisan consortium of institutions that study the pandemic, learn from it, and equips every succeeding generation of decision makers with knowledge and training that enables them to optimally approach an existential crisis. And here I want to make a contradistinction between what I'm proposing here and what I think we'll see sooner rather than later is a series of after-action reports where any particular agency goes out and kind of writes its account of how well they did during the pandemic. Those things they serve a purpose. Usually it's more valuable as an internal exercise, but basically if they're read at all, ultimately they'll get put on the shelf. A key focus for the Pandemic War College would be to enable strategic coordination and end-to-end solutions for critical problems. For example, in the case of COVID testing, the cry went out in early 2020 for everyone to get tested all at once, just at the point in time when supplies were totally inadequate to meet demand, and the test results lagged so far behind as to make them arguably worse than worthless. As with military colleges, the Pandemic War College would discern in detail what went right and what went wrong and why. Most critically, the mission of the Pandemic War College would be to convey the wisdom to every succeeding generation of decision makers so that their coordinated strategic and tactical decisions are optimal. Public health, universities, foundations, emergency management, healthcare professionals, armed forces, law enforcement, hospital administrations, and elected officials and their staff would all contribute to and learn from the work of the Pandemic War College. And by the way, if some of those things that I named sound dissonant, like what does that have to do with it? Every single one of those things, emergency management, law enforcement, the military was involved in our pandemic response. Those who study at the Pandemic War College would be optimally trained to apply situational awareness, strategy, tactics, and coordinated response at all levels of society. Such subsidiarity is the American model. It is the Texas model. This model wins wars by educating leaders who will participate in every level and every dimension of planning and response. This model places its faith in the undefeated genius of societies comprised of free and informed individuals to achieve victory. And I'm almost done, and we'll sit down and have a conversation with here and then have some questions. I want to talk a little bit about, well, what were actually our strategic goals, if you will, at the level of creating pandemic policy in the state of Texas. Number one was to survive and function as an intact society throughout the pandemic and to thrive in its wake. And these are in rough order, if you will, of priority. The other was to minimize serious illness and death. Next, to develop and deploy with all deliberate speed adequate supplies of safe and effective vaccines, preventatives, and treatments, and to closely monitor the pandemic, looking for both worrisome and hopeful trends in the data and trying to understand their respective causes. One last note. It was amazing how much people really, in my opinion, got wrapped around the axle about the data early on. The data was only a guide, it was a trend, and what it should be telling you is that you have three primary goals: prevention, prevention, and prevention. That should have been the message that was there, and the data should have driven that message home to people. When we were there, we started publishing, if you will, things by county. How many cases do you have? And I would have a county judge call me up, and he'd say, hey, my people tell me that we have 8 cases of COVID, and your website says we have 10. Which is it? Well, sir, frankly, you probably have about 800, and the data just hasn't really caught up to it. I couldn't say that. But it's an example of not understanding the place and purpose and value of the data. So with that, I'll be happy to have a further conversation.
So thank you, Dr. Hellerstedt, for those opening remarks, and already there's plenty to kind of unpack there. And so I think the first that kind of came to mind with me, you talked about, obviously, any response was going to have all sorts of human elements, right, applied to it. If you had to pick one, or if there was one that was more significant than other, just the human factor in response, either a good or a bad, I'll let you choose, but what would that be from your perspective?
It's all about, and should have been all about, crisis communication and the 3 basic principles of crisis communication. And by the way, the CDC has a neat course you can take, video course. It's 3 hours long. It's the CDC, so it could be 30 minutes long. But anyhow, to get to the point, the 3 major themes, if you, i.e. the government, want to be the trusted source and you want people to take the actions that you believe will protect them, the 3 principles are: you have to be first with any information that you have. You, secondly, have to be honest about what you know and what you don't know. And then you have to give people something to do to protect themselves. And I really believe that was, the handling of that at the federal level was far from optimal.
So let's pick up on trust. Obviously, there was trust, some distrust that was too easily asserted, and other times there was trust that was asserted in the wrong places. How is from your position as commissioner of a massive public health enterprise, how is it that you either establish that as a trusted source and also combat kind of the other side of, boy, trust is being put in places that really it's not warranted?
Absolutely. Well, interestingly enough, I think, and this is just soundbite, we are now far dumber at the end of the pandemic than we were at the beginning. And it has to do with all of the churn and I'll be nice and say disparate opinions that people have to offer out there. At the very beginning, I think there was an implicit trust in what we had to say. But where it got off the rails was not continuing to always have, from especially elected leadership, not to always have those three principles of crisis communication repeated over and over and over and over again. This pandemic, as I said, I believe it's fair to call it a war. It was that important. It was a global war, if you will. We should have done a better job of giving people an expectation that as this progresses, facts are going to change, and as facts change, policy is going to have to adapt to do that. And those facts can be learning more about the virus. Interestingly enough, one of the most fascinating things from a biological standpoint is how the virus mutated and how that affected its ability to transmit disease through the public. So I think the communication and having repeated, if you will, fireside chats with the American people to say this is going to be difficult, it's not going to be over in a matter of weeks, but we have the means to combat this. One of the things that I said in a news conference with the governor, I said, this is a novel virus. What that means is no human population has pre-existing immunity. But guess what? It's a virus. And we've known how to mitigate greatly and very effectively the spread of viruses for over 100 years. And that was all of those, if you will, personal infection prevention behaviors or non-pharmaceutical interventions, as people called it. Spacing ourselves apart from each other, wearing face coverings and masks and sanitation and personal hygiene. All of those things are highly contributory. And if anybody doubts the effectiveness of those, just go look at what happened this year with influenza and respiratory syncytial virus season. You had 2 years of quiescence. And then all of a sudden, just as the pandemic was going away and people were no longer practicing those personal infection prevention behaviors, it came back just as you would expect it to be.
I've got school-age kids. I can attest to it came back. So with that, let's talk a little bit about kind of the look forward, right? At least the official end of the public health emergency. The declaration, obviously there are policy implications throughout with that declaration. There are funding considerations. What are the things as this kind of comes to a close more formally that would be wasted opportunity, right, to let us pass? What do we need to make sure and seize as we come out of this? You mentioned some of the War College, but are there other, policies or funding priorities that we need to make sure and grab a hold of?
Yeah, I mean, to me, the War College is an all-encompassing idea. So among other things, people used to ask me, well, what should we be preparing, how should we be prepared to respond to the next pandemic? Okay, well, by definition, if you have another pandemic, it means that now you have a situation where all of your defenses have failed, and you're once again facing this crisis situation. And crisis is a very, very risky proposition to be in. So one of the things I was talking about was minimizing disease. My biggest concern that I've conveyed to the governor in January of 2020 is that we would run out of hospital space. And that would create, I think, a panic at the level of society. So the biggest thing that we need to do, again, and the purpose, the idea behind the Pandemic War College is there's no confidence, there's no widespread confidence and consensus in, again, those very institutions that are going to be the ones most capable of preventing and responding to and being resilient through whatever the next crisis is. So we have to, ideally we should be investing in ways to identify emerging pathogens and suppress them before they ever get to the pandemic level. That will require considerable investment. But think of the trillions of dollars and millions of lives that have been lost around the world because of this pandemic. I would hope that we would, just like we invest in ways to deter other kinds of catastrophes from hitting us, I would hope that we'd be willing to invest in what will be some new science that will enable us, again, to detect the emergence of these pathogens.
So I try, and this is your call to action. This is my last question, and then we're going to sit here in silence until somebody asks a question. I try to be a glass half full person, obviously without trying to downplay the loss and the damage that was brought on by the pandemic and the response. Are there any silver linings? Did we as a society or a health ecosystem learn something that we didn't know before? Are there habits that we're going to be able to take advantage of going forward in improving health? And what are some of those?
Yeah, on the micro level, if you will, I think people are going to be much more aware of viruses and viral transmission, and you can see it. There's folks that want to wear a mask in public still. And if I'm understanding what I see on the TV, that kind of habit has been something that a lot of Eastern cultures have just taken for granted. That will be helpful. That's going to help protect some people, and we should respect that. Again, this was a victory, and despite all of the noise and confusion, enough of the people did enough of the right things enough of the time that we had a successful outcome in this. And I think that speaks a lot to the fundamental strength and resilience of our society, that we can have all sorts of information out there. Some of it is valid, other isn't quite so valid, and yet enough people can discern the truth to make good decisions. I really do think, though, one of the things that I would like to see happen is that we create a very conscious and very well-sustained effort to improve what I would call health literacy, and starting in grade school. And I'm not talking about teaching kids really controversial things that various ends of the political spectrum might advocate or abhor. I'm talking about really simple stuff, like, as a practicing pediatrician, it'd be nice if people knew how to tell the doctor what's wrong with you. Okay, I was well until then, and then this is the first thing that happened, and this is what makes it better, and this is what makes it feel worse. That's really pretty simple stuff, and I would love to see a curriculum developed that is analogous to the way we teach kids math in school. I mean, you start with arithmetic, but you have this progressive curriculum so that for those who can and will, you get to the end of high school and you're doing some calculus and some advanced math. I'm not trying to make everybody a doctor, but I really want to give people a solid understanding to where they can discern in a gut kind of way whether what they're being told about health and disease is true or not. As we know, in the world that we have today, between the media and social media and all of those kinds of things, there are people out there who will prey on people's fears in order to draw attention to themselves and gain a following, even if what they're saying is not valid.
I can definitely appreciate the premise as a practicing pediatrician. I'm sure you saw this. I was quick to fire a former pediatrician of ours when I walked in with my 6-year-old, and they looked directly at me and said, "So what's going on?" And I said, "I'm fine. I actually feel great, Doc. Thank you very much." So with that, let me, we've got standing microphones. I think there's one right here and one right over here. If I will call out names. I know enough of you. I've seen the list. If you would introduce yourself and what's your question?
Bracy, and I'm new to this, chair of the board of Harris Health in Houston, so I'm here to learn. So one of the things that was very interesting in the response to the pandemic was the coming together of the CEOs of the hospitals in the Houston, our medical center. That had never happened, and so early warning systems are important and key to sort of deflecting these problems, but also is your response system, and we tend to focus in highly competitive nodes. And I wonder, if we are to battle these challenges, what can we do to bring us together more so that we can have a sort of a coordinated response?
Great question.
Well, I think of my idea, the Pandemic War College, very, very broadly. So interestingly enough, in Texas, we had already had pre-standing, not quite the level of face-to-face cooperation and collaboration that you're talking about in terms of the hospital senior leadership, but we've always had a very admirable system of trauma care. And it's not really just trauma, it's based around catchment areas, the trauma service areas, which typically is a metropolitan hub that has a lot of medical resources, and then the surrounding counties and feeder hospitals, if you will. So we were able to kind of coordinate some of the transfer of patients and some of the hospital care initiatives on that basis. I did have early on, I think it was at least twice a week, conversations with any of the hospital leadership from around the state and go over the data that we were seeing at the state level and affirm or correct it based on the on the ground, boots on the ground perception of what was going on. I'm happy to say that when we gave them the data that we had and the insight and the interpretation that we had, that we were always in agreement and going off. But to your point, I mean, when we were in the bunker, and there literally is a bunker, by the way, that's behind DPS headquarters, got to rub elbows with a lot of emergency response types, guys in uniforms, guys in the military, and a lot of their way of thinking and looking at things I really admire and really rubbed off on me. And so that's where the idea of the War College comes from. You have to train, you have to educate and train if you're going to respond in a situation which, again, by definition is going to be chaotic. It's going to take you by surprise. And that's why you need as many people as possible to be well educated and understand, if you will, as the terms the military use it, what is the doctrine? How do you respond and coordinate in a situation like that? And we need it across the board, and I think it has implications far beyond a pandemic or a public health crisis.
Chris.
Thank you.
Good morning, Phil Beckett with C3HIE. Just great presentation, thank you. I wanted to follow on questions sort of what moving forward. I think you said it nicely that we have disparate opinions of how to respond. So what are your thoughts on public health policies moving forward where we don't necessarily have mandates so that each of us individually can make our own decisions about how we respond to that, but where one person's individual decision, say I'm at very low risk and I'm not going to take any precautions, and someone else might be immunocompromised because they're on cancer treatment, so my behavior may affect them. How do we put policies together that kind of protect everyone and give freedoms as well?
Wow, that's it in a nutshell. And that's where sort of health literacy comes in. So for example, I think for the people in this room are probably very health literate as a group, and they understand, for instance, what you were talking about. In other words, I may be at low risk, but if I'm infected, if I give it to other people, I'm putting them at risk. That second half of that equation was never widely discussed, in my opinion, and never widely understood. And the only way to make that work for people is if they understand it and know it in advance of the crisis situation. They have that paradigm, if you will. They understand how respiratory viruses are transmitted. And then when they get that new information in a crisis situation, it's not something that somebody can come up and say, well, but it's my right to not wear it. Well, yeah, it's your right to not wear it. But the other thing that you pointed out, I think, is extremely essential. If I had to go back and do it again, there should have been no mandates whatsoever of any kind, because we are that stubborn. We are a free people, and if there's a group of our fellow citizens, bless their hearts, who, if you tell them to do something, they will do the opposite. They will dig their heels in and say, you can't make me do it. And they're absolutely right. You can't make them do it. So the message to me should have been, again, this is perfect hindsight, the message should have been, we're not going to make you do anything, but we're going to ask you to do everything that you possibly can in order to minimize the spread of this disease and get through to the other side of it. The thing that we watched like a hawk was the number of people in the hospital with COVID at individual hospitals in those trauma service areas that I was talking about. And because, we had data, we had the number of tests that were performed on a given day. We had the percentage of the tests that were positive on a given day. But guess what? That's only a sample of the whole state. There were only 2 bits of data that had the entire population of the state of Texas as the denominator, and that was the number of people in the hospital on a given day and the number of deaths. Well, of course, the course of the virus is you get infected, and then typically it's days or even longer before, if you're going to get that sick, you end up needing to be in the hospital, and then days or even longer before you may lose your battle, as one of my very good friends did early on in the pandemic against COVID. So we knew that these were lagging indicators, but the thing that we wanted to do was to preserve that hospital capacity, because we could have been, if we'd have gotten into a situation where women in labor and kids with appendicitis and families in car crashes and people with strokes and heart attacks couldn't get taken care of, I personally believe that would have been a very, very serious crisis in what is a basic societal expectation, if you will, in our country, that when I get sick and I really need to be in the hospital, that I'm going to be taken care of. So when the first person died because I couldn't access a ventilator or an ICU, that would be news. When the 100th person died because they couldn't get access to a ventilator or an ICU, that would have been panic. And so slowing down the rate at which people got sick was the fundamental goal of trying to cut down on the rate at which the disease spread.
Others. I think one of the things that I noticed, I was just north, I have to interject just to gain some credibility back from the bio that's in your program. Why doesn't Texas fall into the ocean? Because Oklahoma sucks. I was in the governor's office in Oklahoma during the COVID response, and so a lot of these comments are real life, right, and lived experience. And so, again, I think a thanks to you and your team is definitely warranted. We watched Texas closely in response. Obviously, some of it out of self-preservation, right? Borders are just lines on a sheet of paper. And so we worked with your office closely and always found collaborative relationships and responses. With that, I would invite kind of a last word from you, Dr. Hellerstedt. If there's one thing that you really want to make sure attendees hear, kind of take home, right, the party favor from our opening keynote. What would that one thing be?
Yeah, and I hope, I'll say this, and I hope it isn't self-serving. I think we did a really good job in Texas, or a much better job in Texas, in terms of making that distinction between science and policy. I think the way our news conferences in particular presented themselves, I was seated next to the governor. It was clear that the governor spoke first. I spoke in the middle. He spoke last, in a sense. And that it was very clear that the governor was getting advice from scientists and public health experts. He was making those difficult decisions because it was all about balancing things. If you want to see what goes wrong with taking it to one extreme, look at China. Look at what happened to China. They tried to essentially use all those non-pharmaceutical interventions because they didn't have the drugs and they didn't have a very good vaccine. So they separated people. They kept them from going to work. It caused incredible chaos. And at the end, they still had a problem with COVID because there was no immunity in the population, so-called herd immunity, that came either as a result of recovering from naturally occurring disease or from vaccination. So balancing those interests is extremely important, and I really believe that, in my opinion, at the national level, there was a little bit too much willingness then and now for elected leaders who are the people who are empowered to do this. They're the ones who have the authority to do it. There was a little too much of, oh, well, we're not telling you to do these things. It's these people over here. It's Fauci, it's Walensky, it's the public health people. They're making you do all these terrible things. I would never make you do all these terrible things. And that's disingenuous. And again, I think it's disruptive because people, in the end, realize that their elected officials are the ones who they have empowered and entrusted to make these really crucial decisions.
Great. Join me in thanking Dr. Hellerstedt for his time and comments this morning.